An ambulance is approaching the hospital. From it, doctors remove a gurney with a crippled guy and quickly take her inside the building. They try to do it carefully because the patient's life is hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, in a patrol car nearby, there are two policemen listening to a walkie-talkie, which informs them that students of the Nung Wang school are suspected of attacking. The police lament the morals of schoolchildren and hope that they will be able to catch the attackers before raising a fuss. Meanwhile, the injured guy Si-young wakes up and sees his aunt, who is worried about him. But then he remembers that she left the country a long time ago. Her presence nearby seems strange to him. Before he has time to think about it, a flashback occurs in his head, and he sees those who bullied him, which makes him feel worse. The doctor runs in and gives the guy a sedative. But through his clouded consciousness, he hears the conversation between his aunt and the doctor and learns that he has been in a coma for 9 months. After a while, a half-asleep Si-young listens to his aunt's story about what happened during this time. She says that his parents were worried and said they would never forgive the guilty, and they sought justice as best they could. But the perpetrators were only suspended from classes for a while. The parents tried to attract the public, but they failed. The bullies had powerful parents, and then the guy's father burned himself with gasoline and arson, and his mother stood in front of him with a sign asking people to listen to their son's story. Si-young, without answering anything, cries and hopes that this is just a dream. When Si-young comes to, he asks his aunt what happened next. His aunt tells him that people filmed on the phone how his mother hugged his father, and they burned together, and 2 months have passed since their funeral. The guy becomes sad that he was unconscious at that time. But then the aunt adds that all the perpetrators were punished because the public and the media were seething. As a result, the teenagers received 2 years in prison, and the school principal and the homeroom teacher were fired. The parents of the perpetrators publicly apologized, but even after that, the public did not calm down, and the video gained views. And while Si-young was in a coma, the president even visited him. The whole country was watching this, but the guy's parents were very simple people, so they could achieve publicity without money only at the cost of their lives. Later we see a dialogue between an elderly woman and a representative of the landlord. She rents an apartment in the building, and the man tells her the rules. She should not contact the landlord himself and should not go up to the superstructure on the roof, because that's where he lives. We find out that the mysterious unsociable landlord is Si-young. He is surrounded by bags of garbage, sitting at the computer, finding out information about the fate of the families of his abusers. A message comes to the guy's phone about the receipt of money, which causes him to throw the phone aside. But then a second message arrives. Someone promises to come soon. A young girl knocks on our hero's door, and then, when he opens it, bursts into the room, criticizing the tenant and his lifestyle. She also informs that she has a date soon, so she rather needs to see Si-young. The girl conducts an examination and reproaches the guy for not going to school for 2 years, although everything is fine with him in general. She encourages him to go outside and communicate with other people, but soon realizes that it is useless and leaves the house. Si-young returns to the computer. He hacks someone else's correspondence and reads it. In it, several people discuss that they are in America and enjoying life, even though they had to serve their sentence. They worry about no one finding out about it. Si-young gets upset and angry about this. In despair, he lies down on the bed and closes his eyes. Meanwhile, something falls to Earth from space, which causes a bang and a crash that a young man hears. He anxiously gets out of bed and goes to the door to check what happened. He thinks that maybe they are robbers or ghosts of the past, which makes him even more scared. But eventually he gathers his will into a fist and approaches the doorway, opening many internal locks and latches. When he comes out, the first thing he sees is a bright light blinding him. Having got used to it, Si-young tries to examine what turned out to be on his roof. He freezes in amazement and cannot believe his eyes, because an impressive burning sword has pierced the floor of the roof. Si-young stands on the roof and asks questions. He cannot understand what the sword is doing here and, most importantly, where it comes from. It turns out that the guy has seen such a sword only in online games and he is with his height. From numerous questions, he loses his temper and, in order to preserve his psyche, decides not to think about it for a while. Si-young returns to the room and decides to ignore the find. He falls asleep, but in a dream he finds himself in a crowd of soldiers in armor fighting with winged terrible monsters. In front is a lone tall knight with a sword. The guy recognizes this sword, because it is he who has now pierced the floor of the superstructure in which he lives. Suddenly, something is carrying him at high speed from the place of battle, and finally he only has time to notice how a crowd of monsters fills everything and seems to win. He sits up in a sweat on the bed, realizing that it was a dream, which does not detract from his horror. He tries to realize what he has seen, but he is interrupted by strange sounds coming from outside. He approaches the door in alarm, hoping that it was just a dream. But he doubts his hopes when he sees that the sword is on fire again. Si-young looks around and realizes with horror that not only the sword is on fire, but also the entire roof. The realization that a fire has started in the house terrifies him. He quickly runs into the tub and collects a basin of water. Unfortunately, he is too weak. because he cannot lift the whole pelvis. The guy, splashing water, runs to the sword and pours the rest of the water on it. At first nothing happens and he was running for more, but later he feels pain, while somehow all the fire disappears, forming steam. Si-young sits down exhausted on the floor, out of the corner of his eye noticing a tap in the wall on which a hose is wound. The guy spends his time aimlessly lying on the bed. He stretches slowly, once again hearing sounds from outside. He knows that the sword is burning again, but this time he is in no hurry. For 4 days of this regime, he has already got used to everything. He calmly turns the faucet and picks up the end of the hose, from which water gradually begins to flow. Si-young has a lot of questions in his head again. It seems to him that when he got out of bed, he heard a drum. He also doesn't know why the flame is so tightly connected to the sword. After a while, he lies on the bed again and hears sounds. He is angry, because once again problems with the sword do not allow him to sleep. This time he comes to the very beginning. The sword is just starting to blaze. Sitting on a pre-installed chair, Si-young directs a powerful jet of water from a hose to the fire. He manages to extinguish everything, but, after a moment, the flame returns with the same force. Abundantly pouring water on the weapon and making sure that it no longer tortures, the guy leaves with satisfaction. Later, while surfing the internet, a young man finds a ritual for exorcising demons. He, armed with holy water and a cross, goes to the sword and begins to read a prayer. But something goes wrong, because the weapon begins to torture more than before. But everything passes when the day comes. From this, Si-young concludes that fire appears at night and disappears during the day. But even this alignment does not suit him, because of this sword he cannot sleep and he is tired of it. He leaves, determined to put an end to today. He takes a hammer and, fully confident that it will help him, pounces on the sword. He hits hard and fiercely, using all the rage that he has accumulated over the past few days. But suddenly the guy notices that he is holding only a wooden handle from a hammer, and the metal part is lying somewhere nearby. Angry and disappointed, he, growling, throws a piece of wood and quickly goes into the house to dig through the rubble and find something stronger than the previous weapon. He comes out of the doorway, dragging an impressive-sized bat along the floor. With all his might, he hits the sword with a new tool. Unfortunately, this time the bat does not break, but simply bounces off the sword, and, like a boomerang, hits the hero in the face, flying back somewhere, to the side. The guy himself also falls, holding his face and screaming. Then he slowly rises. He is still overwhelmed with animal rage from defeat and the inability to defeat a stupid piece of iron in principle. Not knowing what else to do, in a fit of anger, he simply wraps his hands around the hilt of the blade in the belief that either the sword or Si-young, but one of them must definitely lose. To the surprise of the guy, fire begins to appear, and later he is shocked to see a huge ball of light forming above the weapon. But later the most terrible thing happens. All this light falls on Si-young and digs into his consciousness, causing the young man's head to split. He sees a kaleidoscope of some events of the past, sees that knight, the past owner of the sword, and then the pictures run out and he realizes that he easily pulled the sword out of the floor. So, with the sword in his hand, exhausted, he falls on his back. Meanwhile, 3 women living in the house are discussing the situation with an incomprehensible noise that they have been hearing lately. Everyone thinks about different things, but their thoughts converge on one thing. Something is wrong with the landlord and they wonder what it is and what is happening. One woman says that she called the manager at the agency, complained about the screams, but there was no expected reaction from that. He was extremely calm. He only said that if screams are heard, it means that the person is alive, and he also promised to call the landlord and sort everything out. The women came to the conclusion that they could only wait. Lying on the roof, Si-young screams and wakes up from his own scream. He hopes that he had a bad dream again, but realizes that everything was too clear for a simple dream. He is more inclined to think that it was some kind of memory, and the mixture of feelings seems too real to him. Si-young has the impression that he has lived a very long and hard life. The guy shakes himself and, getting up, tries to recover. But, looking around, he is surprised to notice that there are no injuries and traces of what happened on the roof, and there is a sword lying nearby, which seemed to have become at least a meter longer. The guy assumes that the weapon could pierce the ceiling of the lower floor. He tries to lift the sword, but it falls with him, too little strength. In the end, he puts him against the wall and remembers his name. The Sword of the Warrior, although people called it incorrectly, the Lord of Thunder and Lightning. Si-young raises his sword again, and this time his newfound memories come to his aid. He tries to cope with the weapon, but eventually falls, unable to stand it. When he wakes up, the guy sees a nurse next to him, whom he had called earlier. Bara was at a meeting when the phone rang and she heard a quiet request for help from Si-young. At that moment, she apologized to the interlocutor and immediately hurried to the guy. She sits by his bed, sees his bandaged body in places and insistently asks, "What happened?" To which the guy lies that he did sports. Bara rightly does not believe him, but then he is distracted by a call from a real estate agency received on the young man's phone. From the speaker, she learns information that screams have been heard in the house lately, but tries in every possible way to cover the guy. Later, she demands an explanation from him, to which he only replies that he was sick and his heart was splitting. Then she remembers how she took care of him in the hospital and relents. He gives out 1,000 instructions about what he should do with his injuries and bandages, and, leaving, promises to return. Lying on the bed, Si-young hears the sounds of the sword again. A young man with difficulty pulls out a heavy weapon from under the bed. He tries to lift it, but it doesn't come out very well. The guy sits down exhausted on the floor, looking at his trembling, tired hands. Suddenly he hears a cheering voice giving advice. The voice sounds strangely familiar and soothing, as if Si-young has heard it somewhere before. And the sword continued to give such necessary advice at this moment about strength, weakness, falling and climbing to the top.